Welcome to A Philosophy of Action. Today I would like to talk about demographic collapse and to a lesser extent the concept of natural selection. In a way it is the judgment of our philosophy, or the basis for selecting what is morally just in your actions. Demographic collapse is the greatest evil known to philosophy of action. Well, maybe not the greatest, but at least one of the great evils. Demographic collapse is not an abstract concern. It is one of the most tangible and pressing problems in our time. Almost every nation in the world, certainly every Western one, and many in Asia, such as Korea, China, Taiwan, and Japan, are suffering from failing birth rates. Simply put, people have stopped having children. Humanity has stopped having descendants. From a philosophy of action's perspective, this is one of the greatest evil, for it represents a people abandoning their own natural purposes. To have descendants survive and thrive. Perhaps humanity is still surviving and even thriving, but it's no longer doing the most important thing in life, continuing itself. The entire reason you exist, the reason your ancestors created you, is to continue that project of life. It is, in a way, the immortality project of mankind. Demographic collapse is therefore a society's inability or unwillingness to continue that project, and thus is philosophically and morally abhorrent to a philosophy of action. The economic consequences of this are more concrete. Demographic collapse has dire economic consequences. As birth rates fall, the number of dependents, people who take more from society than they give, grows relative to the number of providers, those who produce and maintain the system. Dependents include children, unemployed, and the elderly. This isn't about motivation or morality, it's simply a matter of economic function. The true measure isn't the unemployment rate, as is popularly known, which is often manipulated by different definitions. We're specifically talking about the workforce ratio, or how many people are working compared to how many are not. So disabled people are also considered unemployed in this case. Demographic collapse, by its nature, increases the number of non-working people relative to working people. The elderly population grows and the working population shrinks. In the short term, having fewer children may seem to offset this. In the long term, however, this becomes far more costly. The elderly are much more expensive to maintain than children, especially in Western welfare states, because of pensions, healthcare, and state benefits. The more dependents there are, the more labor must be devoted to simply maintaining their lives, leaving less energy for innovation and growth. In many Western nations, within the next 10 to 20 years, entire economies may be forced to dedicate themselves almost entirely to maintaining the elderly population just to provide the current level of care. Some argue that more people are still being born than are reaching retirement age, but this is a statistical deception. You must look at the change in group size, not raw numbers. For example, in a given year in the Netherlands, 200,000 people have become adults, but only 160,000 are being born, meaning that the total population of young people declines by 40,000. Meanwhile, 100,000 elderly are dying, but 70,000 have become elderly, meaning that the elderly population only shrinks by 30,000, meaning that the elderly population shrinks by 30,000, and the youth population shrinks by 40,000, meaning that the youth population relative to the elderly population is decreasing by 10,000 more. This means that this also, of course, means an overall population decline, and even more critically, a shift towards an aging population. The imbalances this exerts on the economy causes more dependence and fewer providers. These are the economic mechanics of decline. Imagine an economy of 100 people. If maintaining each person's life requires 20 hours of labor, then 50 workers supporting 50 dependents keeps the system stable. But it doesn't grow. If however 60 people become dependents and only 40 remain productive, the system collapses, or rather declines. Goods become scarcer, quality declines, and society enters a downward spiral. Even if the total population decreases, what matters is the ratio between dependents and providers. The imbalance is what kills society. To respond, a society can try to increase efficiency, to produce more with fewer workers. But this doesn't solve the underlying problem. Too many people are consuming relative to those producing. You end up with a growing parasitical class. not morally parasitical, but economically, living off the system without contributing enough to sustain it. The elderly once contributed, and children will one day contribute. But the imbalance right now, as in the labor needing to be provided at any given moment to maintain that society, is not able to be sustaining. Here lies the deeper problem regarding this problem. Modern democracy. When people become dependents, whether through employment or old age, they will not vote for policies that reduce their own benefits, at least most of the time. They vote in favor of preserving or expanding their own entitlements. In a society of majority providers, this is manageable. But when dependents become the majority, the democracy will turn upon itself. In the Netherlands, for example, there are 5 million net contributors out of 18 million people. This means that 2/3 of the population and at least a majority voting bloc are dependents. And among the adult voting population, therefore, a clear majority relies on benefits and redistribution. This leads to a death spiral. Dependents vote to expand dependency, and no government, even if it wanted to reform the system, can do so without losing elections. A democracy cannot easily reform itself when the majority are dependent on policies which will cause that very democracy's own demise. This causes what I'd call the welfare paradox. In England, for instance, an obese man with mental health issues can qualify for enough benefits to place him among the top 10% of earners, meaning that a dependent can out-earn a hard-working provider simply by manipulating the rules. Naturally, they will vote to maintain those benefits. This is not unique to Britain. It is a feature of a lot of welfare democracies in the West. In a majority provider society, people will vote to reduce taxes and reward work. But in a majority dependent society, they have clearly voted to expand subsidies and punish productivity. And when that happens, the elderly majority, the largest dependent class, will never vote against their own interest, at least as a group. Thus they drag the entire society into the grave with them. At the same time, the current welfare state punishes child rearing. Parents subsidize the childless, as their children will eventually support both their own parents and the childless elderly without any compensation for this discrepancy. Raising children is also an act of social generosity, as those children will eventually have to maintain the system. But the system exploits this part. And from a philosophy of action's own perspective, however, one should still have children, because it is the moral and philosophical purpose of life. But most people lacking this philosophy understandably choose otherwise. Hence, the population decline will accelerate. This causes a sort of lock-in effect. Once the dependent population starts outnumbering the productive one, democracies become locked into a self-destructive cycle, where dependents vote to preserve their benefits or increase them. Providers will diminish in number and influence, therefore the system cannot reverse through democratic means. There is no democratic way out of this demographic collapse, as those very policies reduce the amount of people willing to be providers. The only possible alternative would be total automation, replacing human providers with machines that don't have the ability to step out of the working population. But even then, why would anyone invest in such a system if the dependents, through their voting power, will simply seize these modes of capital through redistribution laws? Why build something only to have it taken away? Natural selection and adaptation are key values and key phenomena in the philosophy of action that can be looked at to see how this can be an even larger problem. Natural selection is the process by which existence itself decides what continues and what does not. Those who survive and reproduce within their context are selected, and those who don't vanish. To live by a philosophy of action, therefore, is to live by natural selection, to remain adaptive, aware, and responsive to your context. You must understand your goal, having descendants surviving and thriving, and continuously align yourself with the world around you, with one eye on the context and one on the goal. And and your mind on how to bridge those two. That is what it means to live in accordance with nature, according to a philosophy of action. And when you combine these ideas with what we face right now, you simply have a question. How will societies brave this new reality? How will democracies survive when demographic and moral decay make democracies themselves unsustainable? An uncomfortable truth is that the democracies will have to become undemocratic to survive. Those that remain as they are will simply perish. At best, they will decay into stagnant, irrelevant welfare states. At worst, they will die out completely, with their population collapsing to a minute number of people and their territories being absorbed by other states. Take South Korea, for example. Their fertility rate right now is 0.5 per woman. This is a path towards total extinction. Within 20 or 30 years, it will have so many dependents and so few workers that it will not be able to staff its own military. The North will not even have to fight. They could simply walk across the border. The only real solution would be to cut off the support and the country would be annexed. The only real solution to this would be to cut off support to the dependent class, to deprive those elderly, that majority voting bloc, of their political power and then their financial power, leaving them to their fate. But this would, of course, be inherently anti-democratic. But such an act is unthinkable within the humanist worldview of modern democracies. It would be considered inhumane and thus impossible. The only other option is to massively increase birth rates and endure 20 years of hardship, supporting both a huge elderly population and a new generation of children at once. That would be hellish for most working people, but is the only way to survive as a society within the current framework. The only path consistent with a philosophy of action within the current framework as well. Neither of these solutions, however, fit within the modern humanist framework. And that is why, as things stand, collapse seems inevitable. In order to prevent it, we must cast aside these frameworks and embrace one that is more in line with nature and with our natural purpose to life. This has been a Philosophy of Action. Have a good day.